Welcome to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Rosensweet, mom of 3 young people, peaceful parenting coach, and your cheerleader and guide on all things parenting. Each week, we'll cover the tools, strategies, and support you need to end the yelling and power struggles and encourage your kids to listen and cooperate so that you can enjoy your family time. I'm happy to say we have a great relationship with our 3 kids. The teen years have been easy and joyful, not because we're special unicorns, but because my kids were raised with peaceful parenting. I've also helped so many parents just like you stop struggling and enjoy their kids again. I'm excited to be here with you today and bring you the insight and information you need to make your parenting journey a little more peaceful. Let's dive into this week's conversation. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. I'll say more than excited to introduce you to today's guest, who is Alfie Kohn, the author of Unconditional Parenting and many other books. We're actually going to be talking mostly about the ideas in his book from 2014, I believe, called The Myth of the Spoiled Child. And as I said an embarrassing number of times in the podcast, the work of Alfie Kohn changed my life more than any other single person that I can think of. He changed my life in terms of how I parented. He changed my life in terms of the line of work that I went into and how I've dedicated myself to peaceful parenting and being a peaceful parenting coach for the past 12 years. And really, I can't tell you how influential and inspirational this man has been for me. For a long time, I didn't have him on the podcast because I was afraid of being disappointed or that I wouldn't do a good job or whatever. I finally worked up my courage and interviewed Alfie Kohn. So what follows is our interview. We talked a lot about peaceful parenting and also about peaceful parenting in this moment and why we need it more than ever with what's going on in the world and what's going on politically in the United States, that we need to raise a generation of kids who aren't afraid to question obedience and what we tell them what to do and if something is fair and why we're doing something and all of the things that make this kind of parenting harder when they're younger, right? Like obedience is, you've probably heard me say this, obedience is a quality that's kind of attractive in a 4-year-old. You know, it might be nice if you told your kid to go get ready for bed and they go get ready for bed. However, it's not a quality that most of us hope for our children as they grow up. He mentions this in the podcast that, you know, having an obedient teenager, you're not the person who they're going to be obeying. This is really an important podcast interview in general because of who he is and the ideas that he talks about, and also for this moment of helping us to see what's important and have, as I say, have our eyes on the long term. This is a long game, right? And we're thinking about what kind of humans do we want to raise and how do we want them to be in the world. I'm thrilled to share with you the one and only, the man, the legend, Alfie Kohn. And if you are not familiar with his work, we will make sure to link to it in our show notes. I often say that his book, Unconditional Parenting, is the why of peaceful parenting. You can get the how from me and from Corey. And of course, obviously we share with you the why as well. But his work is so research-backed. In fact, last night I was finishing up The Myth of the Spoiled Child. And one of my kids said, "Are you done your book, Mom?" And I said, "Yeah, I've just finished." And he looked at it. And I had a pen as a bookmark, and it looked like I still had about a quarter of the book left. He said, "Doesn't look like you finished it." And I said, "Oh no, those are all the footnotes." If you ever have anyone in your life who needs the research and needs all of the studies about why peaceful parenting works and why it's the best option for raising great kids, Alfie Kohn is the place to send him. And you can send them to us for the how and send them to Alfie Kohn for the why. If you like this interview and you find it meaningful and you think it might help someone else, please share it with them. It really helps us to reach more people when our listeners recommend an episode or the podcast in general. And we would love to reach more people with peaceful parenting. And this message is really one that needs to be heard. So screenshot it, share it with a friend, share it on your social channels. We really appreciate it. Okay, let's meet the man, the legend, Alfie Kohn. Hello, Mr. Kohn. Welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here.
It's so wonderful to have you here. Could you just give a brief introduction of who you are and what you do?
Let's see. Well, I write books and articles and do lectures and workshops on a range of topics having to do with parenting, education, and human behavior more generally.
I've been a fan of yours for a long time. I first read Punished by Rewards before I became a parent, which made me excited to see Unconditional Parenting when that came out. And actually, your work has actually changed the course of my life more than anyone I could name. So I just want to give you,
Wow.
it really has. Like I say that absolutely sincerely. I don't think I would have parented the way I did or gone into the line of work that I did without your work. So thank you. And
Oh,
if
that's
any,
very gratifying to hear.
yeah, it really is so true. In fact, funny story, right after my oldest son was born in 2001, and I think Unconditional Parenting came out in 2004, if that's correct. And
I
2005. Okay. And I must have been talking about it a lot because at one point my husband did something that my son didn't agree with. And he said, Daddy, I think you should read Unconditional Parenting. So
That's bad. Try when your kids say, "What would Alfie Kohn think of what you just said?"
I love it. I love it. So you've written extensively in Unconditional Parenting, which if anyone hasn't read it, we'll put a link to it in the show notes. It's an absolutely wonderful book. You've written a lot about not using consequences and rewards in raising kids. And parents who listen to this podcast are pretty much already on board with that idea. So what I wanted to focus on instead is what you wrote about in The Myth of the Spoiled Child, which honestly is a book we need right now more than ever with what's going on in the world. So when you wrote Unconditional Parenting, the ideas in it were fairly fringe, sort of still shocking, I think, to not use a lot of the more coercive parenting styles. And now I think that those ideas have become a lot more well known to the general public. And from what I'm seeing, we're experiencing a backlash to what you call doing with parenting. I call peaceful parenting. A lot of people call gentle parenting. And critics say that it's too soft and it's permissive. In The Myth of the Spoiled Child, you talk about how historically people have always said we're too soft on kids. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the idea of kids being spoiled and parents doing the spoiling, being coddling, and so on, goes back a very long time. You can find examples of this. In fact, what I tried to do in the first chapter is to go back little by little, starting with the current day when people said, that a few years ago, kids knew what to do. They were ethical, they were well behaved. Parents didn't take any guff. They set down the law. Why can't we go back to those days? And then I go back to the period they were talking about and give examples of where other writers were saying exactly the same thing, going back another few decades. And I sort of follow the trail to make the point that there was never a time when people weren't complaining about kids being spoiled and parents being too permissive. I'm not sure that I see the movement that you are describing since my book came out 20 years ago or so. For example, yes, there's been a move, at least in some subcultures of the United States and other Western cultures, to move away from spanking and maybe some other very harsh methods of punishment. But the idea of giving kids a timeout, which is just a different and in some ways equally cruel form of punishment, I haven't seen any data to indicate that people are turning away from that, let alone that large parts of the population are challenging the use of reward, including praise, and recognizing that also is what I call a doing to approach. I'd like to think you are right. But even when there's the slightest bit of questioning of the traditional approach, you're always going to get a reactionary response to that,
Yeah,
an outrage, that we're getting too soft. You see the same thing, very parallel in education, by the way.
for sure. And I think I didn't mean to say that everyone was absolutely on board with this kind of parenting and now they're not, but it definitely there has been a shift of people know what it is and they were at least willing to entertain the idea. And I think the bottom line is people weren't quote doing it right. Like they kind of misunderstood what it was from the outset. But even that little bit of ground maybe that we gained is there is sort of a backlash going against it. When the reality is that, as you've outlined in your book, and as you were just talking about, and as I see also, we're not too soft on kids. Like that, quite the opposite. Like there's still like most people have a coercive, control based mindset when it comes to parenting. And why do people think that we're too soft on kids? And what actually, I mean, I kind of just alluded to it, but what is the reality from what you've seen over the years of how we actually do treat kids?
Well, I mean, you don't have to take my word for it. You can put on your anthropologist hat and go to a shopping mall on a Saturday and just walk. Yes, there are some kids who are allowed to run wild and be inconvenient and nuisances to others, but for every kid like that, there's 100 kids whose parent err in the direction of excessive control. I think that the real issue is the real problem is that it's not failure to control kids, but a tendency to fear being thought permissive,
Mm.
thereby overcompensating with over control, lest anybody, even complete strangers, view us as, letting our kids wild. We fear the judgment of others, maybe our own parents or in-laws, neighbors, but also, as I say, of complete strangers. And there's research to show that the more people are in public and susceptible to being judged bad parents, the more controlling they become because we live in a society where the idea of bad parenting is mostly conceived as under control rather than over control. Part of the issue, I think, is the tendency to think in binary terms. And that's why when you said before that some people may not have gotten the right idea about gentle parenting or working with approach or whatever we're calling it, it may be because some of our brains are set to two possibilities.
Right.
Either we let the kid get away with what she's doing or we punish her. That those are the only two possibilities. You can only see in black and white. And if I'm punishing, everybody assumes, well, therefore, you're just turning the other cheek. You're not being a good parent. You're not responding because we can't think of another response.
In your book, you had a great analogy to that where you talked about, people arguing that we need martial law or else everyone will just do whatever they want. And I think that's what you're just talking about.
Well, dictators use that same binary in effect of either there's anarchy and there are no rules and people do whatever they want, which means that everything is going to be bloody, or we need a strong man and we're going to set down the law and tell them what to do. That's because dictators cannot or will not conceive of a third alternative that we think of as democracy. And we're watching that strongman authoritarian approach iterate what democracy we've had in the United States as we speak now.
Yeah.
Similarly, in the family, that third alternative, which is not a little bit of control rather than a lot, it's not, the alternative here isn't not black and white. So we say, well, something in the middle with a little control, call it gray. I'm saying the alternative is like orange, something off the continuum, which is a working with approach. It's not permissiveness. That's not what I am advocating. Just let kids do whatever they want and raise themselves and get out of their way. That's sort of the cartoon version of gentle parenting, the caricature of it that is offered by traditionalists as a strategy for defending what they do. This exact same thing is done by traditional educators whose idea of progressive education is that the adults aren't even there unless they're called on and kids learn on their own. And they create this sort of caricature in order to justify direct instruction and traditional rules and a curriculum that the kids have nothing to say about because they don't really understand or don't want to acknowledge the possibility that there's something else, which is the long tradition of progressive education where the teacher is actively involved, but not in the top-down, do what I tell you, here come some facts to forget approach.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes so much sense. And when, the talking about the orange, not black or white, but orange in terms of parenting, do you remember last year when the former US Surgeon General Vivek Murthy gave that sort of health warning about our current state of parenting and how, parents' mental and physical health were struggling because of intensive parenting? A lot of people equated that with what you and I are talking about in terms of the orange parenting or doing with parenting or gentle, peaceful parenting. Would you agree that's, I don't know, just speak to that if you would. I don't know if intensive parenting is that doing with parenting or if intensive parenting is more what you talk about in your book as the over parenting or helicopter parenting. Did you think about that when that
Yeah.
came out?
So I didn't think of that distinction, like what I call working with, where we solve problems with kids instead of just ordering them around on the one hand or being absent on the other. When I talk about perspective taking, imagining how the world looks from someone else's point of view, giving kids more say, being more collaborative and respectful of them, all of that stuff. And I imagine variations of that are what you talk about on
Yeah.
this podcast in your own work. I don't think that per se is confused with intensive parenting that's exhausting that the Surgeon General might have been referring to. But I think there's another confusion that goes on when we talk about the kind of overparenting that is bad, which I guess is all overparenting. The prefix over, by definition implies excess and therefore not ideal. But the question is, how much of what's going on is overparenting? And I think we're a lot more worried about parents being too involved than we are about the lack of parental support that most kids enjoy. And I think we have to think about it deeply, not just how much parenting is too much, but what kind, and then go a step beyond that to ask, maybe it's not just a question of how you're parenting or how much you're doing, but why you're getting as involved as you are. Throughout in my work, I'm very interested in thinking about how we respond to what kids actually need. They don't just need to be loved, they need to be loved unconditionally, which means for who they are, not for what they do. So there isn't this notion that we're going to dole out the good jobs when they jump through our hoop. So they come to feel that when they're not pleasing or impressing their parent, they're not loved and therefore not lovable. We have to figure out how to respond to what kids sometimes they need us to support their autonomy. Sometimes they need us to lend a hand rather than stepping back so that they'll trip and fall and pick themselves up and brush themselves off and somehow get better on their own, you know. But they're our parent. And here's where there is a genuine kind of problematic overparenting, who are getting involved with your kids and hovering, not because that's what their kids need, but because that's how they need to feel loved and important. So the kind of parent who thinks the more you do for your kid, the better, is actually acting out the parent's own need to feel relevant in the
Right.
kid's life. And whenever it's the parent's need driving the action rather than a response to what the kid truly requires, that does become a problem, I think. But, and here's where the real confusion comes in. Where this kind of thing becomes a problem in its effects, not just in the motive, it's because it's too controlling, not because it's too indulgent.
Yes.
The conservative critique of helicopter parenting, overparenting, and so on is usually based on the kind of right-wing notion that kids have it too easy these days,
Right.
which is what people have been saying forever. And that's not what the research supports. When parents get too involved or involved in the wrong ways or for the wrong reasons, it's just another symptom of the tendency to over-control. And That's the same kind of control they've been doing with timeouts and loss of privileges and good jobs and stickers and star charts and all the rest. And so the response to all of this is not up, back off, let your kid do stuff on their own, stop worrying. It's not less parenting that we want to advocate for. It's better
Right.
parenting, which involves more support for the kid, or when they need it, even if other people think that's too involved. But most of all, support for kids to be able to be good decision makers as well.
Yeah, and I love that you brought that up. I was going to ask you about that, how a lot of people see, helicopter parenting as sort of, that too indulgent, they'll never be prepared for life, as the opposite of authoritarian parenting, like that fear-based, control-based parent, but that in the end, they both come down to control, just a different kind of
Yes.
just control, and it just looks different, but it's actually just still controlling kids.
Yes, no, that's absolutely right. And by the way, when you look at the research on helicopter parenting of older kids, like college age kids and beyond, the research doesn't begin to support what you find in the popular press all the time. First of all, what most of us would think of as really excessive involvement is much rarer. It's just the same few sort of scary anecdotes being passed around in the popular press. When you look at the hard data, most college age kids don't think their kids they're connected to them more than people of our generation were to our parents when they're in college. But that's not the same thing as parents intervening.
Right.
How-
You also make a point that some kids need more support than others, depending on,
Yeah,
where they are in
that's right.
life and their, their temperament or their skills that they have. And that, sometimes more parenting isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's right for everyone.
It's often quite helpful, according to some surprising research there. And that's absolutely right. It depends on who you're talking about. Kids who are the first in their family to go to college, for example, typically need a lot more parental support. The one-size-fits-all prescription of, let your kid fly off and back off now and just see him at Thanksgiving, really doesn't make sense for all kids. And it comes from a a white, middle-class, highly educated Western culture, which in turn is based on a model of individualism that suggests that the way you measure success when kids get older is that they're self-sufficient. But that's not the way most of the world thinks of maturity or optimal development. And so we tend to universalize our own cultural assumptions in addition to treating all kids as if they're the same.
Yeah. In my experience, I mean, my kids are 18, 21, and 24, and I only have one left at home. And my experience is that we see them a lot and talk to them a lot, but it's not because we're over involved. It's because they like us. They want to spend
Yeah,
time with us,
that's a
and
good
they want to talk to us on the phone, and they want to come home for dinner.
Yeah, that's a sign you've done something right, and that's the kind of thing we ought to think about when we're parenting younger kids. Are we acting in a way where when the kid finally has a choice, are they gonna wanna spend time with us?
100%. So your book makes a really compelling case for the idea that traditional parenting, where kids, better get used to it in terms of the world being a harsh place and where they're controlled, and obedience and not questioning authority are seen as admirable qualities, that this is serving a bigger purpose, is to keep the status quo of who's in power and the way things are run. And your suggestion in your last chapter, which I loved, is that we need to raise reflective rebels by raising a generation of kids who will push back. And this really made me think of what Cory Booker recently said when he was quoting John Lewis, when he said, "We need to make good trouble." So can you
Yes.
talk a little bit in closing about what a reflective rebel is and how the working with approach makes this possible and hopefully more likely? Because I think we all need like a little bit of hope and good news right now.
Well, what we need is, first of all, an accurate understanding of where things stand, not to be hopeful when that's unrealistic just to make ourselves feel better. So I'll sort of push back on the idea of hope as self-care when it turns out to be rooted in illusion.
Okay, be
But
realistic with me then.
yeah, right. Well, I think that what we need is to raise a generation of kids who will not simply go along, who will not view their task in life as to follow orders, to be compliant, which is what so many adults really want. We talk about kids being critical thinkers, but we get really annoyed when they challenge us. And we have to be willing. There's another parenting author I like, Barbara Coloroso, tells this story that I like to tell too, where about a mom who was wailing about what happened to her teenager. When he was young, he did everything I asked. He always followed instructions. He was obedient. He was the perfect kid. And now look at him, who he hangs out with and how he dresses and what he's doing. What happened to him? And Coloroso's response was, he's exactly the same. You raised him to do what he's told, and that's still what he's doing. It's just that other people are doing the telling now.
Yeah.
Which means if you want a kid to be an independent thinker who is truly ethically sophisticated, you have to start by raising a kid where you welcome the pushback. You may want to say it's more respectful to push back this way rather than that way, but you ought to be excited when your kid says, but why? Is there a reason for that? Why are we doing that? But that doesn't make sense, or I don't think that's fair. You need to support that even when it's inconvenient for you if you want the kind of kid who's brave enough to challenge a narcissist felon running the country. Or if you want somebody who's able to push back when peer pressure is going in a direction you don't want. We want kids who will not just mindlessly or reflexively do the opposite of what they're told. We want them to be reflective, but to ask hard questions about what they're being told by parents, by teachers, by employers, by government officials, by everybody. That's beneficial for them because it represents a very sophisticated way of being in the world, but it's also what we need collectively to be able to organize folks who are thoughtful about what makes sense and what's fair and just for all of us. So a fair and just society that's rooted in genuine democracy begins at home by not only meeting your kid's emotional needs, but helping to support your kid being someone who doesn't just take things at face value and go along and do what they're told.
Thank you so much. I always describe your book to parents as the why behind why we do this kind of parenting. And I totally am going to say it again. Thank you so much for your work. And you really did influence me and my life and my children's life more than any other single person. So thank you for that. And I have
Thank you so much.
Yeah, like really, honestly, from the bottom of my heart. And I was so nervous for this interview because you've meant so much to me. Actually, I've had this podcast for a few years, but I didn't invite you until now because I was nervous about how it goes. So thank you for being an easy person to interview. And
Sure.
yeah, my final question to you is one I ask all my guests, which is if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
I would just remind myself that when you sort of run out of rope and patience, your job is to find more rope. That none of us is the ideal parent. We all fall short, but that there's an important difference between failing to live up to what we know is the right thing to do and to be our better selves on the one hand, and not even recognizing that we're falling short on the other. So if there's a voice within us saying, that might not be the best response here, I understand that I have room to grow as a parent. That's good news. Be gentle with yourself if you aren't able to do that all the time, which nobody I know, certainly including me, can live.
That's true. That's so true. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today. And I look forward to having all my listeners hear from the one and only great Alfie Kohn. I really appreciate you.
Thanks so much, and thanks for your work.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. I hope you found this conversation insightful and exactly what you needed in this moment. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Remember that I'm rooting for you. I see you out there showing up for your kids and doing the best you can. Sending hugs over the airwaves today. Hang in there. You've got this.